Welcome to the Going to Seed monthly podcast. I am Joseph, and my guest today is William Schlegel. William is an educator and botanist. As an educator, he loves to teach students about botany, plant breeding, seeds, and the natural world. He is fascinated by the conservation of plants and the effects of climate change on sustainable food systems. He sees plant breeding as a way citizen scientists can help adapt their communities to climate change. My personal interaction with William began many years ago. And since that time, he has been my closest collaborator on the beautifully promiscuous and tasty tomato project. We frequently share seeds and photographs, and we communicate about the project. In many ways, I feel like the project has become William's project because he's taken the idea and he's ran with it and did just beautiful, amazing work. And we'll get to talk about that today. So welcome, William.
Hi.
Is there anything additional you'd like to add to the introduction?
Um, Trying to think if there's another similar question coming, or if you've just sort of phrased it differently than. But one of the more important things I do in life is I am the father of a 6-year-old boy. He's about to turn 7. And the duration of his life is pretty much the duration of my tomato breeding. Because as he was, even back when he was an endoparasite in 2016, I was growing some tomatoes. And I had a couple tomatoes in 2016 that volunteered. So I kind of started the garden late because I left Santa Barbara. We came home to Montana to have Theodore. And I had 2 tomatoes from seed that produced a few ripe fruits. I thought to myself, you could almost direct seed tomatoes in Montana. So I saved some seed from those. But then I started getting online and I started looking for the shortest season tomatoes that you could find. And amongst the sources I found for plant breeding stuff, I'd been interested in plant breeding for some time. I found Joseph. And I was like, well, I think I've heard of this guy before. But, I was down in California. I didn't have garden going on. And he had on his website, you had to send him silver dimes for a packet of seeds. How do you do that? Okay, so you get on eBay and you can buy a roll of like 100 of them for like $100 or something. So I did that. They came, put them in an envelope. I mailed them to Joseph. I said, I want, and 100 seed packets that didn't actually cover everything Joseph was selling back then. It was probably about the height of Joseph's personal gardening and seed selling, and he had more than 100 projects going on all at the same time, and he saved seed from and he sold seed for. So I said, give me what you can for $100, But then at the same time, we started talking on Permies.com about this idea I had of, I think we could direct seed tomatoes into Montana maybe, but I imagined this was going to be like a hard plant breeding project. Then 2017, when it was one of those hot, and of course, because it was a hot year, it's also a intense fire year. So the sky filled with smoke, but the tomatoes did wonderful. I tried taking a few of them to the farmers markets, just deserted because, no customers, but everything worked. So I was like, well, shoot. But I also discovered Joseph had written about how some tomatoes have these exserted stigmas that stick out. And Alan Kapuler had written an essay about tomatoes that occasionally outcross. And so I looked through the 70 varieties or 70 kinds of tomatoes, some of which included Joseph's landrace at the time and some things in my 17 garden. And I found one where the stigmas really stuck out. and it was Lee Goodwin's, what did he call it? Blue something. Anyway, it was one of Lee Goodwin's tomato varieties, and it was so unstable that it was still really variable. But 4 out of 5 of the plants that I had planted had these stigmas that just stuck way out of the pollen cone. So I went around my garden with 70 different sorts of tomatoes. Some of those sorts included some of Joseph's landraces that were like lots of kinds. So I don't know how many they really represented. And I gathered mixed pollen and I dabbed it on as many of those stigmas as I possibly could. And then I saved all the tomatoes from that variety. And then the next year I planted out F1 seed and I tried to identify F1s. And then next year I grew out the F2, just like a massive direct seeded garden. And I probably wasted tons of genetics there because, it's like really hard to tell one boring red tomato from another. I don't know who the father was, but I found some with stripes, and they were almost certainly fathered by what I think was a Mirsky Tiger or Amur Tiger that I bought one plant of in 2016 at the Missoula Farmers Market. And that one plant did great. So I saved seed and I tried direct seeding it in 2017, and it did great direct seeded. It came back as a volunteer. It was all over my 2017 garden, so that was probably the father. And it actually led to two varieties that I have in these little baggies that are, one's striped in red and it has the exserted stigma, and one's striped in yellow and it doesn't really have the exserted stigma. So anyway, I think I digressed a bit.
So what can you tell us about your background outside of farming or including farming or?
Well, I grew up here in Western Montana. I hold 2 degrees, a degree in biology with an emphasis in botany. It's a Bachelor of Arts, so I sometimes say I'm an artist and then I'm allowed to wear funny hats. I got that one in like 2001. And then I got a Bachelor of Science in secondary science education. So I can teach, and I'm a certified science teacher here in the state of Montana. So I can teach 5th through 12th graders science.
Nice.
And then, grew up, I'm kind of the first generation off the farm of my family here in Western Montana. My parents are both school teachers. They met at the time that's kind of the state teaching college in Dillon, Montana, and they were both students there. But my mom was kind of more from a ranching family, and my dad was more from a wheat farming family. Mm-hmm. But then my dad's mom is more from a ranching family, and my dad's dad is more from a wheat farming family. There was a recent study published a few years ago that found that basically all European people descend from are about 50% Turkish wheat farmer and about 50% Russian cowboy. Apparently, the Turkish wheat farmers invaded Europe about 7,000 years ago, and then the Russian cowboys invaded them about 5,000 years ago, brought along the pneumonic plague, probably wiped out about half the wheat farmers and replaced them genetically.
So tell us about your early life that led you to crop breeding.
Well, my mom sort of established a policy where I got to pick something to grow. And I remember I picked sugar beets one year. And so we grew a big row of sugar beets. And one year I picked peanuts and we grew a big row of peanuts. And the sugar beets were extremely productive. This was before sugar beets were GMO, and it was easy for burpees or gurneys or whatever it was to just offer them to the general public. And my mom said later, "Oh yeah, I canned those in with the other vegetables. You ended up eating a lot of them." It's like, oh yeah, kind of just like, well, what do we do with these? I don't know. But the peanuts were a crop failure, though John Shirk managed to do it in Indiana. And they had them at Snake River a few years ago. They had a variety of peanuts, so it's possible. I haven't tried to get back into peanuts, but it is possible. Got to try it again sometime. And then when I was about in high school, we kind of moved down to Missoula so that my sister could start college. She was like 15 at the time. And we had a different house down there in a different yard. And my parents were kind of, I don't know, they were busy or what, but they weren't putting in a vegetable section. They did a lot of gardening in the backyard, but there wasn't a vegetable section, or there wasn't a, so I wanted to grow some stuff, and there wasn't an all established garden area for it. So I kind of asked if I could, and they were like, yeah, sure. So I just went out there, dug up sod, and moved it onto the sod pile, and prepared, a small garden area. And I got some Ethiopian teff seed and some wheat seed. And I remember I grew Christmas lima beans from I just bought a bag of rabbits at like an organic grocery store, and some other random stuff in this little plot. And so that was, in high school. And I threshed out the Ethiopian teff when it got ripe, and I ground it in the blender, and I made some graham crackers out of it with a graham cracker recipe I was a little obsessed with at the time, and got it from a workshop at Montana State University in Bozeman that I think I attended between 8th grade and 9th grade. Anyway, so I had a little, project to try to get blue flower corn out of the painted mountain flower corn when I was in college. A few things going on like that. I was, I read Carol Depp's book, but at the same time I was a biology major, so I did take a evolution and genetics class at the college level there with my first degree. And then I'd taken, high school genetics, of course, in biology class as a sophomore in high school. And, that what we teach you, like if I were your science teacher and I was teaching you genetics, what I would teach you actually would be more than most people in the history of plant breeding have known.
Right.
But I feel like most high schoolers don't really pay attention to that. They're not that interested in some of the presentations on Gregor. There was this old dude, he's dead now. His name was Gregor Mendel. But I don't think a lot of the students actually get excited about high school genetics. But I was pretty excited. I was breeding guppies in high school. So
one thing that we share is I was also breeding guppies in high school and junior high school.
It's pretty fun to, I wasn't very hardcore about it, but I mean, like, you pick out the one you want, you put the boy you want in with the girls, you take the boys you don't want and put them somewhere else.
Right.
Have a tank where you put everybody you don't like very much.
Yeah.
It's kind of crowded. Anyway, so that's the sort of thing.
What are your local growing conditions? What were they like, when you were there at that age? What are they like today?
Well, today I have tomato plants that are still unfrozen. It is October the 14th. I have a historical belief that my garden should freeze on September 1st. Like the hammer should fall and horrific frost should come. And that still happens sometimes. But I feel like it's not happening as often as it used to. When I was a kid growing up in the 80s, the summer skies were very blue. Now, about every third or fourth or every fifth year, the summer skies are gray with wildfire smoke. I would say that something has changed or is changing. And, as a science teacher, one of the things I would tell you about that is the climate is literally always changing. It is either always going up in temperature or it is always going down in temperature gradually. And we, when my father was a student in the 1950s, they taught a lot of those students in the 1950s that they might be being raised on the precipice of a new ice age. we were at about the end of the interglacial period, and we might start sliding back into the next glacial period. That's actually still true, but anthropogenic climate change, which most believe strongly in, does seem to be having some impact.
So what's your soil like, your fertility of your fields, that kind of stuff?
Well, 2003, when I bought my garden land, I had taken a soil science class. I didn't do very well in the soil science class. It was definitely like a hard C for me because there wasn't much for my brain to attach to there. But I went out there, I looked at the land, and I knew it had been a grassland. I was like, mollisoil. This will be a mollisoil. This will be a grassland soil. This will be a fertile soil. I should have dug a hole, should have dug a hole, should have dug a hole. The soil survey for my land, which is now available online, and I now know how to access it online, which I did not 20 years ago, says that my soil has a 7-inch plow layer over a 7-inch clay accumulation layer. That's 7, and then under that, there's a few other like layers, but it comes pretty quickly. It comes to lacustrine parent material, which is the sediment that settled out onto glacial Lake Missoula when glacial Lake Missoula was here, and little silts and fine clays and silts settled out in the water, and there's deep layers of that. And you can see those deep layers down along the Flathead River here, white cliffs and that's lacustrine parent material. But lacustrine parent material isn't too bad, but that 7-inch clay accumulation layer is a bit problematic. Water tends to go down and then run across that 7-inch clay accumulation layer. It's like water runs under my soil. So it's not good soil.
Sweet. Well, should we get to the tomato project?
Sure.
Tell us about what you're doing with tomatoes.
Well, probably my most intense project is this one. And I don't think I can actually show you guys tomatoes very well. It doesn't look like they come through very well. But this is a hairy little tomato, and it is a cross between Joseph Lofthouse's promiscuous tomato project and a tomato called LA 2329. It's a Solanum habricades accession from the Tomato Genetics Resource Center. And I haven't particularly gotten anything back edible yet from this project, although I think I'm getting there. But there's a researcher who made some arthropod resistance lines from the wild accession, the LA 2329. And he put up a very interesting YouTube video a couple of years ago. So I've been sort of plugging away at recreating his work. I'm not sure if it will work, but it's a very interesting, tomato. So I've restarted kind of the promiscuous tomato project and taken it back to the extremely unpalatable phase.
Can you define arthropod for us?
That's bugs. Well, and technically, when we talk about bugs, we should only be talking about hemipterans, the true bugs, the bugs that have the little diamond-shaped section on their back that we know they're true bugs. But so really not bugs. Anything with a hard skeleton and a gooey middle that a spider could make a nice meal of by injecting it with liquefies its insides. But actually, probably most realistically, it's something that would be potent against mites and thrips and the little teeny tiny white flies, the little teeny tiny insects that plague our crops. I didn't do a very good test of it against Colorado potato beetle this year, but I would say that the Colorado potato beetles seemed pretty happy with it, but equally happy with it as the things without any arthropod resistance. So I don't think it's going to be anything we can use for Colorado potato beetles on tomatoes, for instance, for the larger.
This summer I was growing cactus, and I had all these little seedlings that were about the size of a pea, and grasshoppers came in and ate the cactus in my greenhouse, but then they immediately died. So I was kind of pleased with that. So you were recreating the initial promiscuous tomato project then with your crosses with the LA 20.
Yeah, and this tomato is then 5/8 wild.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. Have you found anything other than green fruited in that line yet?
No, but having been through kind of generations of growing the first promiscuous project, you reduced the wild down to about a quarter,
Uh-huh.
and then we got all these elites, things that look like this. This
Uh-huh.
is XL red strain promiscuous project tomato.
I'm so
Um,
glad you're still growing that.
well, there's strains of it, and then there's strains of it. Anyway, I reduced some down to a quarter,
Uh-huh.
and I had what I thought was a lot of seed, and then I got 5 plants from that, lots of seed.
Oh
And
no.
one of those 5 plants, I doubt I'm going to get what I want from the one plant, but I did save a lot of seed from it. I'm sure next year it'll segregate out some edible tomatoes and palatable, probably some elites, but it's too narrowing of the genetics to actually hope that the arthropod resistance will come through. But I've made more crosses like that for next year, so we'll see.
Very nice. So when you're working with the tomatoes, what kind of selection criteria do you have?
Well, I left out this part of my tomato story earlier, but in 2000, Amy and I were taking well, I was just taking classes because, one of the last schools with a botany program in the country, and my girlfriend just happens to go to school there. So yeah. So we went to Oregon State together in 2012, 13 winter. Or was it the 2011, 2000? Yeah, it was a 2011, 2012 winter. Anyway, so we took these classes at Oregon State. We took plant genetics together from a barley breeder there, Patrick Hayes. It was great. Amy was like, "Yeah, B is good enough." I was like, "What, Amy? What? This is the coolest class ever." But Jim Myers, the Oregon State vegetable breeder, released his blue tomato in the spring of 2012. So we bought seed from, and we were so excited to grow this cool blue tomato that Jim Myers had bred Oregon State. And then the year after that, I got on Brad Gates' website and I was like, how the heck did he manage that? I mean, Jim just released this thing. He's got like 12 varieties of these blue things. How do you do that? Just quite the backstory there.
So
Um,
I also had tomatoes of that variety that were illicit.
and this one here is a Tom Wagner, and it tastes really good. And I made a cross with it this year because I discovered it last year, and I was like, oh, that's actually really good tasting. But yeah, apparently they had a bit of a leak of genetic material from that lab. Some grad student or lab assistant sent out a bunch of seeds, and all the breeders went crazy and made these beautiful blue tomatoes and just tons of them. And I still like that blue trait. It captured my imagination a little bit. I like blue things. Usually wear a blue
Uh,
shirt. This one's slightly green, but and so I had some Brad Gates tomatoes already. And so I crossed probably Brad Gates Blue Gold with a little tomato that was in one of Joseph's mixes with potato leaves. And it was probably the one Joseph calls Brad because some of them have segregated out with the little gold spots. But so I grew lots of blue tomatoes. So that's one of the things I look for. And then I have been pretty careful to try to get this exserted stigmas trait back.
uh,
And it's actually quite a bit of work to get that back in its more extreme forms. So you have to take something like this exerted tiger tomato that's my red with stripes. And they're sort of weak stripes and it's sort of weak blue. But then you end up with a lot of things like a yellow tomato with the stripes, but then it doesn't have the exerted stigma. So you end up with two tomatoes and you keep one in sort of just your collection. And I released exerted tiger to the world a little bit through the Snake River seeds in early, like I think it was F3 or F4, but it's not everything I'd like it to be, but it had the exertion pretty reliably, I thought. So I put it out for other people. But that's one of the things that I would really like to do with this is try to make a tomato that has a lot of traits that would be really useful to young people just wanting to start with amateur breeding, because I think that exerted stigma is really useful. You know, Joseph's first attempt at that was his Big Hill or HX9 tomato. And it's a nice tomato. It's regular leafed and it's got a big fat exerted stigma with kind of an open flower a little bit. And it's really easy to make crosses with. You don't even, if you can't figure out how to rip those anthers off with some tweezers or forceps, you can just dab on there and go to town and you'll get some crosses. But this tomato is my attempt. So I took the tomato to improve on it a little bit. I took the tomato that Joseph bred and I crossed it with the one I bred, which was one of his tomatoes times one of Brad Gates' tomatoes. And I got something I call Mission Mountain Morning. So I called first one Mission Mountain Sunrise, and then this one's Mission Mountain Morning. You probably see where I'm going with this. Just keep reusing the same name with different times of day for a while. Anyway, and I got a potato leafed one. And I don't know where I'm going with that, but I used it for 12 crosses last year. And then I used those 12 crosses for a ridiculously large number of crosses this year. And I probably just some of the things I wanted.
Yeah, potato leaf really useful for making crosses, because if you cross a potato leaf with a regular leaf, then the crosses show up in the next generation easy as can be.
Yes. And so I'd like to sort of stack some of these traits into what I think of as a mother variety for tomatoes. Then I could send out to people and they could make their own crosses. And I like these fancy things like stripes and the blue cut skin. So I'd like it to be striped and have blue skin and potato leaves and a really nicely exerted stigma. And, but I want so many things on it that I'll maybe never be done with it. So we'll see.
Right.
So are you direct seeding these all the time now, or are you still starting them inside?
I do both. I do a weird mix of both. So this very large tomato was direct seeded in my Montana garden, but it's a Joseph Lofthouse promiscuous project XL red strain tomato. And it was surprising how well that did direct seeded this year. And it says a little something pro that strain. It's like, oh, we got some really big tomatoes and they came out direct seeded just fine. Of course, the tomatoes haven't frozen and it's October 14th. And what's up with that?
So are your seeds available from like Snake River Seed Co-op and Experimental Farm Network both?
I think that Snake River might have some of my stuff still. I didn't want to take the space away from breeding to grow another generation of some of it. So I think some of it, they might have even had somebody else growing a generation of.
Nice.
EFN, I just sent them a packet of seed, about 5 ounces of seed. No, a little less than that, 4.6 or something. 4.3, I don't know, of a Grex of the 10 or 11 of the 12 crosses I made last year. And hopefully they'll offer that Grex. And then I grew out what I wanted to be Joseph's project in an isolation garden this year for the going to seed group. I would say that a certain percentage of those tomatoes are going to have some blue on them. Tomatoes cross, apparently, when
Right.
you're being able to cross at a higher rate.
Can you give us some Colton tips about growing tomatoes and selecting them among those populations?
So, you know, Joseph, your promiscuous project is confounding me a little bit on the selection front of things. So I made a selection 2 years ago for this project. And it had been segregating a while, supposedly. So it was like, okay, this is probably like maybe this is like in the F4 already or something. It almost has to have crossed. So this whole bag is from my. So I said, this is the one. And I've been calling it the one. Now the one is 6 different tomatoes. It's a cherry tomato. It's an orange cherry tomato with some blue on it. It's an orange tomato. It's a yellow tomato. It's an XL red tomato. This one's kind of pretty. I don't know if I can hold this up and you can kind of see those green stripes. I think of those as Habrocades stripes. So it's somewhat some good old Habrocades stripes. I've got 6 tomatoes saved from that. So it's my isolation project. So from Joseph's project. So I would say from that one, I would say it doesn't necessarily behave well when you try to isolate. Well, except part of that is I put it in some crossing blocks last year and then I recombined. So it had some opportunities to cross. I didn't actually think it had taken those opportunities, but I think it did.
Right.
And I thought the cross would go maybe best one way, or put in the potato leaf mothers, and that's where I was expecting the cross. And then I took those seeds and I grew them out looking for regular leaves. Nope, not a regular leaf in the bunch. Gave them away to a couple colleagues who they call their outfit Seedlings for Solidarity, and they give away seedlings to people. So I was like, yeah, take these seedlings. They're locally bred, but they took up. But I think the cross went the other way. I think the one accepted the pollen of the Mission Mountain Morning and Mission Mountain Sunrise instead of the other way around.
Nice. So can you give us some ideas or your ideas about what we should be growing in our gardens in order to attract pollinators?
Okay, I'm going to drop something in the chat for that real quick.
Okay.
Let's see there if I can find it. Here in the Northern Rockies, a group of researchers, and I'll just refer to them as Runyon et al., found that 9 native plants will support 80% of the native bees, and native bees are extremely diverse. So the plants they used in their mix, and there's some asides here, they use Bebb's willow. You could use whatever is the most common willow, native willow in your area. They use kinnikinnick, they use silky lupin, they use woods rose, they use snowberry, they use showy fleabane, leafy aster, and blanket flower. And this was sort of revelatory to me as somebody who thought I was gardening for the bees. Snowberry wasn't on my radar as something I needed to grow because I have a bunch up on my hill. And I was like, I don't need to plant any of that. I've already got it on my hill. Those of you who are, like if you were in Europe right now, you don't have snowberry. I just checked Wikipedia earlier today, and there's a coralberry in Asia, but there's no snowberries in Europe. So you'd have to go to the family level and find things in the twinberry family and the honeysuckle family and grow some natives in the honeysuckle family instead of snowberry. And showy fleabane, leafy aster, and blanket flower are all just things in the aster family. So you go a mixture of things in the aster family, kinnikinnicks in the heath family and the blueberry family, something in the blueberry family, lupins. So in the northern hemisphere, you're just going to find a willow, something in the heath family, some kind of lupin, some kind of rose, something in the twinberry or honeysuckle family, and some asters. But I thought bee balm. I thought bee balm and horse mint would be extremely important for bees based on just observation, because they just get swarmed by them. But I was actually wrong. When you actually do the research, kinnikinnick and snowberry are so important to native bee conservation. So, but kind of general advice. There were a couple of bee researchers down in California that I met when I was working down there years ago, and got to go to a bee ID workshop for work. And they did a huge study in California, and they went to a lot of like botanical garden and things, and they ran their study. And their biggest advice was grow a wide diversity of flowering plants in your garden. Most gardeners, most modern gardeners are no longer doing that. Most traditional gardeners totally are. I mean, it's just part of what we do. But if you go like your average suburb and things are like landscape, and it's like there's this very narrow range of plants. So grow a wide diversity of plants, and maybe pay attention to this work from Runyon et al. And think about growing some things off their lists. Because
snowberry. What was the other plant you said besides snowberry?
Bebb's willow, kinnikinnick, silky lupin, woods rose, snowberry, showy fleabane, leafy aster, and blanket flower. Now, this is specific to kind of the northern Rockies. You guys down in Utah, you're probably more the central Rockies. So this is going to change a little. And, like even I look at this Bebb's willow, and I'm like, why did they only test Bebb's willow? Scowler's willow makes so much more sense because it has a wider ecological amplitude. But they didn't test it for the research. I mean, the researchers, they test what they test, and then they have to publish or perish. But yeah, I'm going to grow Scowler's willow instead of Bebb's willow and see how it does. But it's very interesting to think. And why do you guys suppose willow's so important?
Well, when I used to keep honeybees, the willows were the first thing to flower in the spring before any other plant was flowering. They were producing pollen.
Yes, and it's pollen, and they're not. They may be affecting a little pollination for the willows, but I mean, willows are mainly wind pollinated. They're pollen robbing off those willows. They're getting some pollen food from those willows, and they're just stealing it because they're not really effectively pollinating the willow. But I mean, like, yeah, early in the spring, willows, and often they're covered in the little itty bitty native bees. So, yeah, and it's a little bit more water for a willow bush, but yeah, having a willow bush somewhere in your yard can do things for bee diversity.
Right. Well, so we're coming up on the end of the hour. I'd like to open it up for any questions from our participants.
I have a question first.
Okay.
I wanted to talk about fava beans for just a second, because that's one of your projects. This year in my garden, I grew my fava beans, harvested them. I just cut them off at ground level, so I always let the roots just stay in the ground, and then next year I'll plant again. But they came up and they're producing a second crop. Does that happen often? Is that unusual?
That's not unusual. It's definitely something I've noticed. Some strains do, some don't. Mine were a horrible mix. Are a horrible mix. This was a skip year for me on fava beans, just because busy or whatever. But some will do that.
So is that a good trait to? I haven't tasted them. I don't know what they're going to taste like. I don't know which, because mine are a landrace already. That's what I started with, was Joseph's landrace. And so I don't know which ones they are that are producing the second crop. But if they taste good, that would be a good thing to breed for, wouldn't it? Get two crops off of one planting.
Sure.
Okay. So, I'm always curious.
Favas were on my list of things to talk about, so thank you, Holly.
Sorry.
No, I just skipped over it.
Oh.
I also know that you were doing some work on Claytonia. How is that working out for you?
Well, I haven't actually seen any progress, but I've gotten to play around a little with Claytonia diversity, and it's interesting.
Can you plug Claytonia and tell us why we all should be breeding Claytonia?
Okay, this is what I noticed about Claytonia. And I am going to give a plug out to a former colleague, Thomas Stoughton. He lives in like New Hampshire or nearby somewhere now. But he was on the mountaintop district of the San Bernardino National Forest when I was on the San Jacinto Ranger District. And he went on to get his PhD at Claremont College, associated with the Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, which is recently rebranded itself to the California Botanic Garden, to my great, you have no respect for tradition. But anyway, they rebranded themselves. But anyway, Tommy has a great website called claytonia.org, and he has some great diagrams on there, or illustrations of diversity within the Miner's lettuce complex of 3 species. So it's a 3-species complex, and there's lots of natural hybrids out there in the wild. So you could literally just go out in the woods in the western part of the United States and find quite a bit of genetic diversity in the Miner's lettuce complex, 3-species complex. Why I think that's important is there's only one species, and basically only one variety of one species available commercially for gardeners. So it's something that in the wild already exists as fancy lettuce, basically. And in domestication is just one boring variety of lettuce. So this thing we call Miner's lettuce, the diversity that's already out there isn't available to gardeners, isn't available to farmers. And I think it's an important group because it's one of 2 crops that Elliott Coleman grows as winter crops, winter lettuce crops in Maine. The other is a little thing called, what is that called? Corn salad. And it's from Europe. But there's a feral population that I found just out in the 20-acre field behind the house here.
Of corn salad?
Yeah. Yeah, I posted a picture of it once, like February or something. I went for a walk and I saw some poking out. And you're like, it's green in February? I'm like, yeah, it's February. This is why Elliott Coleman grows it in Maine in cold frames, sells it to people for fancy lettuce greens.
Yeah. So how can we get hold of you, William? Holly, I think, will drop some links into the chat, but you can tell us too.
Go to the open source seed initiative plant breeding forum, and you'll probably find a bit too much tomato talk for me there.
Sweet. All right. Anyone have last minute question for William?
I see one in the chat from Justin a while ago.
Oh yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, you can't see me. I'm not sure what's going on. But I don't really have arthro problems that I've noticed outside here. I do have liver spider mite issue inside. And the Galapagos are fine. Penelli's fine as well. I can notice a little bit of spider mite, like right now. I have to order more predators, but I can notice a little bit on the crosses, including Galapagos and Penelli crosses. But I wonder, I'm not sure, William, if you've got to F2 with the Galapagos crosses yet, but I wonder if they'd be good against arthropods.
Theoretically, yes.
Yeah, theoretically.
But testing, I have no way to test.
Yeah, fair enough.
Now, if my wife, who's gotten to be quite the plant pathologist, and she got really excited about cut flowers, she just let me breed spider mites and whiteflies and what's that other thing she hates? Thrips inside over the winter. I get in so much trouble. I'm not allowed to spread spider mites intentionally, I don't think.
I've been maintaining a pet population.
I have a general question, and apologies for messing up the time. I meant to check in an hour sooner, but I mixed up the time zones. So I'm in Australia, and we have a feral population of Pimpinifolium, and which is fairly common all through Australia. And I'm guessing in other parts of the world too, that there's there's initial foundation populations of Pimpinella folium that have gone wild and gone through all sorts of local selective pressure. And I'm just wondering if you have any sense about how useful that resource might be for including in tomato breeding programs.
You know, there are these classic varieties: Florida Everglades, Spoon, a Mexican Midget of Pimpinella folium. I found last winter, I found a really interesting book, and it's like the first book on tomatoes written in the US. And it's some guy in the late 1800s who was trying to promote his tomato business. His selection procedures were pretty suspiciously bad, but whoever made the book, the modern version, included a list of the varieties that were available back then. And guess what was available? Currant tomatoes were available in the late 1800s. And there was a sort of famous tomato breeder in I think he was active in like the 20s, 30s, 40s, you know. And he actually went down to Mexico and made some crosses. And I found out that this really old tomato from him, it's like 50% Pimpinella. People still swear by Florida Everglades. I would go for it. It's there. You got it. Use it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I just wonder, like, I only know what's happening in Australia, and my tomatoes, this wild strain of Pimp, just turns up in my goat paddocks. Like, I do nothing. Like, the birds spread it, it just grows without any preparation. The fruit quality is better when it goes feral in my vegetable gardens, but it's got, I mean, what can be a more consistent selective breeding program than just surviving on your own terms, basically, without humans involved?
Just a general comment, though, about Solanum pimpinellifolium. One of the reasons why Joseph's work with Solanum habercates and Andrew and Joseph's work with Solanum pinellii was so interesting is because they have this cool feature where they are obligate outcrossers, like tomatillos are. Pimpinellifoliums are by and large, they just self. So there's tremendous diversity in Pimpinellifolium, but it's across strains. It's not within strains. But then these nasty green when ripe things that weren't selected by birds and humans, they have the obligate outcrossing, and they have within accession deep genetic diversity because they have all these recessives hiding in there. So if you think that all the local Pimpinellifoliums are likely one strain, just keep that in mind. It's one Pimpinellifolium strain's worth of genetic diversity, and it's just there because it got to Australia first somehow. Which is great. But I mean, like, and it probably does evolve at a faster rate than garden tomatoes because it's got a lot of territory, so the population size is huge.
I have one other question that I've been meaning to ask to a tomato breeding expert. So I have a strain of tomato that I really love that I picked up from another tomato breeding person who I've lost contact with, and my notes are terrible. But I've got it marked as having chilensis in its ancestry. And I wonder, is that likely, or is it a mistake on their part or my part? It's got brown fruit that are quite large, and it grows almost as vigorously as a Pimpinellifolium for me.
There's some strains. Did you say Chilensis?
Yeah.
There's some strains that early moderns and types. One that I found just from local regional breeding is the Payette tomato, named for Payette, Idaho. Payette had, and I guess it's a fairly common problem in the Western US, leaf curl or something like that. Curly top. And it's a viral disease spread by leafhoppers, which are a true hemipteran. And they couldn't find, and this was a long time ago, over 50 years ago, I think. They couldn't find a domestic tomato that seemed to have any resistance. So that we have to go back to the wild ancestors. And they went to Peruvianum and Habercates. And Then they took this thing and they crossed it with a few different things, including like the classic tomato of North Dakota, bison. And then they crossed it to a tomato called Sioux over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Back crossed it until they bred out all the nastiness they thought. And somehow they ended up with a true dwarf, fairly small, saladette-sized tomato, has some resistance to curly top. And it's got hardly any wild in it, but it's like, okay, so this thing's like 99% Sioux, but it's not at all like Sioux. So what did they do? You always have to ask yourself the question, because like they thought they knew what Honeycrisp was and what the parents were. The notes were wrong. They actually did the genetic testing on the Honeycrisp apple, and it's not from the parents they thought it was from, because even at a university breeding program where you're taking careful notes and, like seeds get in the wrong dish, pollen gets from the wrong plant to the wrong plant, not everything works. So when you genetically test these things, but we have this amazing pedigree of pay, and that's what we think happened. But it's a very different, it's a true dwarf. And I just realized Payette has 2 offspring that are also true dwarf, and just ordered seed for the second of them. But it's really interesting that we had this wonderful local regional tomato breeding happening right up until 1990, and then it just stopped because universities kind of moved on.
All right. Like to thank my guest today, William Schlegel. It's been a pleasure, William. And thank you to Holly and Julia and Anna for the technical support today. And with that, it's a wrap until next week or next month. Our guest next month will be Evan Sofro. And Evan worked also on the Promiscuous Tomato Project with me up in Idaho. And Evan inspired me to learn to play the guitar. And so I'm sure we'll have a lot of interesting conversation next month as well. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It was very interesting. Thank you.